Hello and welcome to another Lightboard from Appvia.io. My name's Graham Coleman and today I'm going to be talking about role-based access control in Kubernetes. So, role-based access control, quite often known as RBAC, abbreviated. It's been around for a long time. And we use role-based access control in Kubernetes to limit or give access to resources within Kubernetes to users and remote subjects. So, who are we trying to protect, or who are we trying to give access to? So we have two. We have human accounts, so our users. So our users need access to Kubernetes and to the constructs in Kubernetes. And we also have service accounts, which are non-human, typically access given to applications to do things within Kubernetes. So we need to give access to these people. So what do we do? What are we giving access to? So in Kubernetes, everything is known as a resource. So we have resources in Kubernetes. So let's look at a resource. So a resource is everything in Kubernetes. So it could be a pod, it could be a deployment, it could be a secret. In fact, everything you can think of in Kubernetes is defined as a resource, and that resource is accessed and protected through its API and the API server. And that's what we'll be applying the RBAC constraints against, access to the APIs within the resource. So, how do we connect the users to the resources and give them access? So we do that through RBAC, and the first part of that is to define a role. Now, a role is a way that we can define the resource that we're protecting. So a role will have, so first of all, we'll have a kind, which is role. And this is the data that you'll have inside of the RBAC. We will have the resource that we're protecting. So in this case, let's say we're protecting secrets, or we're giving access to people through a role to access secrets. We'll have a namespace attached to the role, and I'll come back to that in a second. Let's give it a name, so my namespace, INS. And we'll have a name for this actual role. Let's call this my role. So we're saying here that our resource that we're protecting is the secrets resource, and we'll have a list of verbs that someone who has this role can do with that resource. So it'll be get, list, delete, etc. So I've now created a role which will give access to secrets. So now I need to connect my role to my users. So how do I give a user access to this role to be able to look at secrets? So we have another construct in Kubernetes RBAC called a role binding. So it's got a kind of role binding. It's also got a namespace. And that namespace, it's still my namespace. We need to connect the role binding to the role, so we have a role reference. And that role reference connects the name, so my role. And we also have the subject, the important part about how do we link the subject to the role. So we'll have a subject. And let's say I have a user called Graham. Over here, so a concrete subject. So I'm going to give access to Graham. And that will link our user all the way through to my role binding, which will have a role that's attached to that role, which will be related to a resource. So what I'm saying is Graham has a role which gives a get, list, and delete access to this resource, which is a secret. Now, if you can see that I've got namespace inside of these two controls, that is really to give access to, constrain access that I've got to secrets within a single namespace. So this role binding, or this role definition, can only access, so I'm saying Graham can only access secrets by get, list, and delete within my namespace. So the namespace here, my namespace. And that's the thing about roles. So roles are namespace bound. The definition of roles and role bindings will only give access to namespaces that's been defined. We can do other things with it, which I'll mention in a bit, but essentially that's role-based access control within a namespace. Now the second part of role-based access control is how do we give access to subjects across the cluster? So we've got some more constructs here. So we have things called a cluster role. Now the cluster role will be similar to our role. So it'll have a resource, a name, it won't have a namespace. It'll have a name and it'll have the verbs around what it can access. So let's put these in. So let's say our resource, we're going to be protecting secrets again. Let's give it a name. So let's call it my cluster role binding, my CRB. And we'll say we can do a get, list, and delete. Now, so that cluster role can now enact upon secrets anywhere within the cluster. It's quite a powerful role, so it means you can start to read secrets. So similarly, we can link this through to who can do this by using role bindings. So this time we've got a cluster role binding. So cluster role binding. And similar to the role bindings, it has a role ref, or a cluster role reference, and we list this to my name, so it's my cluster role cluster role. Oh, God. And we'll also have a subject. And let's Graham again. So I've now connected via a role binding a cluster reference or cluster role that gives Graham the access to my CRB, which enables me to get, list, and delete secrets anywhere within the cluster. So this is now our role that we've just defined is cluster wide. So this is anywhere within the cluster. So that's quite a powerful role to give anybody. So what I'm saying is Graham has kind of got this admin role across all the cluster to get, list, and delete secrets within that cluster. Now there's two more things I'd probably like to mention. So actually, roles can access cluster roles. So if I had a role which had a role ref of my CRB, then this role can access this cluster role. So what does that mean? It seems a bit odd, but it actually means that I can define cluster roles at a cluster level and have a single role that maybe gives access to secrets. But I can bind it to a role binding that's namespace scoped. So this says that on here, Graham can access through this role binding the cluster role, my cluster role binding here, which has access to secrets to get, list, and delete, but that will only apply in my namespace. So it's not cluster-wide, but it has access to the roles which we can define cluster-wide. And that can be quite useful where we can define lots of different or roles across the cluster without creating roles within each of the namespaces that we've got within our cluster. So that's quite useful to do that, although it's kind of counterintuitive that I've got a cluster role that's namespace scoped. But that's why it exists. Probably the other thing to mention is that roles can be aggregated. So rather than creating a single role, I can create multiple roles and label them as such, and then create an aggregated role which will give me multiple access to multiple things, multiple resources through a single role. So that was basically role-based access control. There's a few other things that you probably need to think about when creating role-based access control. One of the things is making sure that we've got all of our role-based access control configured correctly. Because if we can see here that Graham's got access to listing, getting, listing and deleting secrets across the cluster. So quite often we'll have secrets which are admin access to other parts of the system or other systems or this cluster. So there's a potential that Graham can get hold of secrets and actually escalate privileges beyond what he should be doing. So be very careful about your role-based access control. There's an open source tool called Crane. So if you go and look at appvia.io, Crane is an open source tool which will enable you to introspect all of the role-based access control configurations, so the roles, role bindings, cluster role bindings, etc., and report on and apply a set of rules to report on the state of your role-based access control. So it'll give you some highlights as to what the dangerous roles look like. This to me looks like a dangerous role and probably shouldn't exist. So it enables you to rectify that. So take a look, go and look at appvia.io website. There's an open source projects tab on there. Scroll down and you'll find Crane as an RBAC visibility tool. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. We'll be presenting another aspect of security on our next Lightboard, so look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.